Now we're going to get to the last and greatest example of Republican symbolism for Americans in the post-revolutionary years, and that's George Washington himself. George Washington becomes the living personification of everything I've talking about, particularly the living personification of virtue. Everything George Washington does, the way he holds himself, his dignity in public, the way he dresses, the things he says when he speaks, his decisions about office, the fact that he doesn't wear a uniform as president, for example, and that he retires as president, that he doesn't take a title. All of these things are meant for Washington to be a living example of what it means to be a Republican. And he's very, very self-conscious about that, and Americans respond to it greatly. So let's look at George Washington, the Republican hero, and the American Cincinnatus. First, I want to tell you the story of Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus is another Roman hero, and in Cincinnatus's case, he's a hero because of what he doesn't do, as well as what he does. So let's do what he does first. Cincinnatus is a farmer in the early Republic, and he is asked at one point to become the dictator of Rome. And that's an actual office. It's an elected office. And what it is a kind of war leader, an emergency war leader. And it has a symbol of office, and you can see this on the left of the painting. The guy in the green has got this thing over his shoulder. It's an axe tied together with a bunch of reeds. And this thing is called a fasces. And the fasces was a symbol of authority in Rome. And the idea was that each individual reed was easy to break when taken separately, but if you tie them together, as the Romans united themselves, they were impossible to break. So here's Cincinnatus getting the symbol of office. He's called upon basically to be a general in this war. Rome is under attack and may be destroyed. Will he take on the authority? And he says yes. But then Cincinnatus does something even greater. After he defeats the enemy, he goes back to his farm. And this willingness to relinquish power is another side of virtue. He's a virtuous citizen because he defends his country, but he's an even more virtuous citizen because he doesn't let the desire for power corrupt him. He goes back to his simple life, an equal of everybody else. George Washington becomes known as the American Cincinnatus. So here's Cincinnatus again with his fasces, accepting, in this case, or maybe returning the symbol of authority and power once it's no longer an emergency. Well, George Washington takes on that role in America. So I talked about Charles Willson Peale and his patriotism. Here is Peale's famous painting of George Washington at Princeton in 1783. And you can see that Peale painted Washington a whole bunch of times. This is the building in the background there is it's Nassau Hall, the oldest building at Princeton University. There was a battle at Princeton in the American Revolution, and here's Washington with this defeated, trampled British flag at his feet and the symbols of warfare, doing his duty as an American hero. Here's Gilbert Stuart's famous unfinished painting of Washington. Stuart painted Washington over 300 times. Washington only sat for him 3 times, but Gilbert Stuart painted Washington over and over and over because he could sell the paintings. And these things are all over the place. There's one in Vermont. And this is also the portrait on which the dollar bill is based. And there's Gilbert Stuart's Martha Washington that he painted at the same time as the dollar bill portrait. And here is another version of Stuart painting. This is a full-length portrait of Washington. This one was commissioned by a British nobleman of all people and hangs in England. Let's see Washington some more. Washington's very frequently portrayed on horseback, and the horse is always white, and the horse always has this particular gait to it. The head is erect, the front leg is up, Usually one of the rear legs is up too, and the tail is wagging, and or at least erect. And Washington, by the way, was a superb horseman. Everybody said that. Looked great on a horse. And here he is reviewing his troops as the American heroic general. Another image of the same thing. Posture of the horse, the front leg up, the rear leg isn't always up. Tipping his hat in this one. Very, very common pose. Again, the horse is always white. And this goes back to a tradition of heroic statuary that goes back to the Romans, maybe even the Greeks, I don't know, but the Romans certainly did this. This is a portrait statue, of equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, who was one of the 5 good emperors of Rome, portrayed on a horse in a very similar stance and as a heroic leader. Here's a medieval version of the same thing. Look at the pose of the horse here. One leg up, tail erect, head up. This is, the ancient tradition of the hero on a horse, and we see this in Washington over and over and over. Almost the exact same pose of the horse. And here is a weather vane, and we know this is a George Washington weather vane because of the horse and because of the rider tipping his hat on the top. This isn't Napoleon or anything else. This is George Washington. And the funny thing is today that if you show this to people without any sort of hint and just ask them, who is this? Most people, most of the time, will say, most Americans will say, hey, that's George Washington. And if you ask them how they know, they're not even sure how they know. Because of the hat, maybe, but they know, I think, because we're still used to seeing George Washington as this tremendous hero. So, a very interesting example, because it's just a silhouette, you don't know who it is, but you can still recognize Washington there. Just more poses of the same sort of thing, Washington with his officers. And now I'm going to run through some of the ways that George Washington continued to be celebrated long after his death as this Republican hero. This is a George Washington whiskey flask. You can see on the left, it's a little bit blurry, but there's a portrait of Washington there, so you could drink your whiskey and contemplate the father of our country. Here's George Washington carved on a whale's tooth by a sailor, probably in the South Pacific, with the American eagle over his head. Here is a set of plates that was commissioned by Washington's officers, the Society of Cincinnati. Cincinnati is the plural of Cincinnatus. So these are the people who were emulating Cincinnatus, and they're also emulated George Washington, their leader. This was basically the alumni association of Washington's officers, and they commissioned their own special tea sets, or china, I guess in general, table china, and this is some of it, close up of their crest. That eagle there was their crest. Here is a bizarre image of George Washington that was carved onto an ostrich egg. Don't ask me how or why. Here's a building that is preserved to the memory of George Washington. This is in Lower Manhattan. Look at the buildings behind it. I mean, it's tremendously valuable real estate. And what it is the Fraunces Tavern. It's the tavern where Washington said goodbye to his officers at the end of the American Revolution. They were in New York when the peace treaty was signed. The officers meet and they disperse, and the army disbands in 1783. And Washington gave his famous farewell to his officers in this building, and I'm convinced that's why it's still there. Washington died in 1799 after serving 2 terms of president and then retiring. And there are all sorts of memorials to George Washington for many, many years after his death. Here's the George Washington Memorial picture. The city of Washington itself is a memorial to him. Congress voted to name the District of Columbia Washington in 1800, the year after he died. And then there's a biography of Washington that comes out in 1800 too, called The Life of Washington. Went through 11 editions by 1811, very, very popular. It was written by a parson, is known as Parson Weems. And Weems's Life of Washington, hugely popular. And we still tell a story from it, the story of the cherry tree. Washington cuts down the cherry tree as a little boy, and when his father confronts him, he says, "I cannot tell a lie." Why can't he tell a lie? Because he's virtuous. He's a personification of virtue, and virtuous men don't lie. So here we have Grant Wood's 1930 painting of this story. And the painting is a little bit of a joke because instead of a little boy, we see George Washington's adult head on the body of the little boy, as if to say Washington was George Washington all the way through. He never was a little boy. He was always the great Washington. One more thing about that story, it wasn't true. He never chopped down a cherry tree. He never said, "I cannot tell a lie." Weems made it up. The point is, though, that it fit Washington's persona so well that nobody cared. It was one of those things that even though it's not true, well, it should have been true, so we'll just accept it as true. That's what George Washington meant to the development of the American idea of republicanism and virtue. He was the great example. And that's why, to this day, he's still considered one of our greatest presidents.